Transport and Climate Change Week will not be what it is without civil society. And as we have been working for years alongside Agora Verkehr, we want to invite in this moment Nabil and Christian to introduce us to the session. Welcome, and the floor is yours. We cannot hear you, Nabil, so maybe your microphone needs to be on. Okay, there you are with us. Welcome and good day for everyone. Now the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Good morning, evening, afternoon. Welcome to everybody in all parts of the world to our session, Connecting with African Think Tanks for Sustainable Transport. My name is Neville Gerisep, Senior Associate here at Agora Verkehrswende, and we are so happy to welcome our panelists and participants in our session today. I'm here joined by our Executive Director, Mr. Christian Hoffeld, and he will give us some opening remarks. Christian.
Thanks very much, Neville, and thank you all very much for participating in this session today. A very warm welcome also from my side here in Berlin. Dear friends and colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, the sustainable development, or better, sustainable economic growth, builds on sustainable mobility and a climate-neutral transport system. The transport system is the backbone of our social and economic development. In the 21st century, the African continent will be the continent with the highest growth rates globally. This is in terms of population, economy, but also in regard and with regard to mobility and also motorization. That's why it is important to notice that the transport system is very much threatened by climate change. The last example, we saw this catastrophe in southern Spain, in Valencia, where this thunderstorms and this heavy rains caused a huge also transport system breakdown, which shows that the reliable transport system has to be or will only be possible in the world without the damages and the losses of the devastating climate change. That is one reason why we have to meet the targets of the Paris Agreement to keep the increase of the global average temperature well below 2 degrees, close to 1.5 degrees, which already will be reached in this year. That shows that there is a huge urgency in action. So that means that we have to be climate neutral by net zero until the mid of the century. Currently, if you look at the net zero tracker, more than 90% of the countries globally, 90% of GDP and the 90% of the emissions have committed to be net zero by 2050. So that means that we can secure sustainable economic growth if we reach this net zero targets by 2050 globally, only as a joint task and only as a joint venture. So we can either achieve this together or we will fail one by one alone. That means that we have to transition away from fossil fuels. That is the official language of UNFCCC. We can also say that we have to phase out completely fossil oil and gas by the mid of the century. Together in the energy transition and combining the energy transition with the mobility transition. Germany decided to go this pathway of net zero electricity in 2011 after the catastrophe in Fukushima, the nuclear catastrophe in Fukushima, to phase out coal, phase out fossil fuels in the electricity system as well as nuclear power by mid-century. But how can this be done? This was a big question in 2011, and we, bringing together an ethics commission under the lead of Professor Klaus Töpfer. You may know him because Klaus Töpfer has also an African footprint, being or having been the lead of United Nations Environmental Program for a long time based in Nairobi. And he mentioned first that sustainable energy system and the energy transition is a joint venture. Is a joint venture by all the governmental and societal stakeholders, including the industries, the non-governmental sectors, and also the governmental institutions on all levels of our political system. He was calling for a national forum for the energy transition. And closely afterwards, the Agora Energy Transition has been founded, our bigger and older sister. It was philanthropically founded by Stiftung Mercator and the European Climate Foundation. Exactly, being this or trying to be what Klaus Töpfer, also insisted in, being a think tank for an energy transition and transport transition, the transport transformation, as a think tank for net zero transport by 2050, net zero transport by the mid of the century. What can a think tank do to support and underline these goals and this vision? First of all, the think tank can be a visionary itself, setting targets. But honestly speaking, the target of transponing and transposing our transport system, transitioning our transport system by 2050 to net zero is already a hugely ambitious target. So having more ambitious target is a little bit, unrealistic. But a think tank can be a cartographer and a pathfinder, saying what are the ways with regard to the political and regulatory framework, what are the ways and how do we achieve our targets with policy and regulation, with engaging all stakeholders on the way to this net zero transport. And a think tank can be a platform provider, a marketplace for ideas and recommendations to the government how to achieve this target. And it can be, as a platform provider, also a system to get majorities behind this transformation, because only if we get the majorities to accept this transformation, we will succeed with this transport system. At the end, we can also be, as a think tank, a mediator between different interests and different meanings and different opinions to see how we balance the different interests and how we find a consensus on the way forward. The benefit of being independent is clear. We have more credibility in the system, and we can turn projects and processes in policy roadmaps and in long-term strategies which are necessary to achieve our targets. It's pretty sure that solutions will be country-specific. That is why in Europe now we have more and more institutions like Agora across European countries. We have similar organizations in France now, in Italy, Spain, Poland, and more to come. Together with GIZ, the Deutsche Gesellschaft für Internationale Zusammenarbeit, which is hosting this Transport and Climate Change Week, as you know, we started to support building a network and building also single think tanks and a network of think tanks on the African continent. The idea is to see if this is also beneficial, like it is in Europe, to discuss ways to decarbonize transport. it's not only a one-way street from north to south, but this is something where we all learn from each other in both directions of building bridges between Europe and the African continent in this transformation with transformational partnerships for mutual benefits. Understanding the transport transformation more and more, not only as a national joint venture, but as a global joint venture, we can secure sustainable development, sustainable mobility, the mobility system in total, and so we can secure global economic welfare, which definitely is necessary, especially on the continent, on the African continent, which will be the growing continent of this century. So let's turn this huge challenge together into a great opportunity, not only for climate change mitigation, but for the benefit of our societies. Thank you very much, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion today. And I'm really also excited to see more cooperation from our side with think tanks, institutions, also scientists and activists on the African continent for a net zero transport system. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christian, for those inspiring words to open our session.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, participants, before we introduce our panelists today, we would like to inform you that you are able to share your questions and comments in the chat. And for us to test also the platform, we are going to use a additional platform called Slido, where you would be able to share some of the reactions to the insights. So for now, I would like to welcome you, please, to go to the chat. And we are going to have a test question so that we are able to see how you respond with Slido. And the question is, how do think tanks add value to sustainable transport efforts in Africa? So in your view, how do think tanks add value to sustainable transport efforts in Africa? You're able to scan the QR code and then respond as a tester. Thank you. Very interesting responses coming through. I think we'll allow 2 more minutes so that we can gather all the responses. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you for your responses. I see that not all participants were able to join, but we are very, very interested to see some of the outputs that came out, such as the role of collecting data, providing insights, providing policy support. A very interesting perspective from the participants on the role of think tanks and how they can add value. Thank you very much. And now, to move over to our panelists for the day, I would like to introduce each of our panelists and for them to provide a short introduction and then give us insights into some of the work that they have been doing in sustainable transport in their respective countries and regions over the past year. First of all, I would like to welcome Ms. Malindi Masoni from the Zambia Institute of Policy and Research. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Neville. Yeah, my name is Malindi Msoni. I'm a researcher and the head of the Transport and Infrastructure Development Unit at the Zambia Institute for Policy Analysis and Research. I feel very privileged to be part of this process as an alumni of the Agora Sustainable Transport Fellowship and the lead of the alumni network. It's such a pleasure to be able to support this initiative. So ZIPA is a think tank established by the government of the Republic of Zambia through the Ministry of Finance and National Planning. And we were primarily established to provide evidence-based policy advice to the government and other key stakeholders on a number of social and economic development issues, transport being one of them. I'm sure all of us who are here appreciate that transportation is very central to driving economic development. Now, coming to the topic of the day, sustainable transport. Sustainable transport is an important policy agenda for the Zambian government, although it's not been explicitly stated in our policy documents. We are a signatory of the Paris Agreement, therefore we have committed to reduce emissions in this sector. And we are seeing some direction, in terms of policy that is being developed to steer us towards this. But something that Christian mentioned in his opening remarks around solutions being context specific, I just want to briefly just talk about how sustainable transport, this discussion of sustainable transport has been applicable in our work. I think the conversations in the global north have heavily focused on reducing emissions, which of course is a very key part of sustainable transport, especially looking at the impact of global warming. But in the context of Zambia and a number of African countries, emissions from transportation have remained really negligible. So the conversation for us has to be broadened beyond emissions reduction and looking at other aspects of sustainable transport like access, equity, inclusion, and safety. And this is where much of our work as ZIPA has focused, looking at research that can provide evidence to compel policymakers to really walk the talk on their policies and promoting other types of transport modes like non-motorized transport, which are very critical in this context of sustainable transport. Some of the recent work we've done in partnership with the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy with support from the Climate Compatible Growth is trying to see how we can transform the existing infrastructure in the capital city of Zambia to prioritize non-motorized transport. Particularly here, we're talking about walking and cycling. This is important because the majority of people actually in our country walk for daily travel. So we have been promoting work that is trying to show this and to amplify this in the policy discourse and actually trying to push government to actually implement the strategies. So we are also doing some exciting work right now with with the CCG around developing transport energy scenarios, a tool that we think is very important because it will help policymakers visualize how different policy choices can drive different outcomes. This is important because we've noticed a significant lag between policy and implementation, where we've committed to certain initiatives in our policy documents, but we are not implementing those. So as a think tank, we need to bridge this gap and actually provide compelling evidence to policymakers, like knowledge products that they can easily relate to so that they can actually implement these policies. And scenario development is one of those tools. And maybe just to end my introduction, I just want to emphasize how important it is for think tanks to come into this space to really push policymakers in Africa to walk the talk on their policies, because we have seen overwhelming response from a lot of governments in terms of putting in place strategies around non-motorized transportation, but very few of them actually implementing and actually putting in place infrastructure for people that walk and people that cycle. So I think now I end my introduction here and hand back over to you. Thank you.
Much. Thank you for those insights, Ms. Musoni. I appreciate it so much. We are very interested to hear more in the discussion round on some of the key points you have just shared. Thank you. And now I welcome Mr. Montmaison Claire from the Trade and Industry Policy think tank in South Africa to share his introduction and insights. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neville, and thank you to both GIZ and Agora for the opportunity. It's really a pleasure to be part of this discussion. Coming to you from Johannesburg in South Africa, and I wear two complementary hats, which I think are useful for this discussion. One is as introduced, with trade and industrial policy strategies, where I lead work on green industrial policy and just transition, primarily in South Africa. And then I also part of a recently launched organization called Southern Transition that looks at global South opportunities in the transition across sectors. And of course, that includes transportation, particularly from a value chain perspective. And the work that I've been involved in around transport value chains has been from a variety of angles and, I guess, entry points into transport value chains. From a South African perspective, a big part of the work that we've been involved in is around how to manage the transition to electric vehicles, and from both a supply and a demand perspective. From a supply perspective, South Africa is the largest, most advanced automotive maker on the African continent, along with Morocco. And that really poses quite a significant risk to the local industry, because of course at the moment, the industry produces internal combustion engine. And so how we can shift the industry, we have currently now 7 automotive manufacturers in South Africa who are producing vehicles, soon to be 8. And so we have a very limited window to transition these production, because most of the vehicles produced in South Africa, depending on the manufacturers, between half and 2/3, end up in Europe and the UK. And of course, as those countries transition, the production systems in the country have to transition as well. And so big issues in terms of investments and skills and jobs and employment, and how to manage that over a very short period of time. And complementary, we have to think about the demand, the local demand, because yes, as I said, maybe half to 2/3 of the vehicles produced in South Africa end up in the UK or in the EU, but the remainder ends up on the local market. And so we have an issue where our local market also has to sort of have some traction and some demand, so that effectively manufacturing remains viable. And of course, to date, demand for electric mobility in South Africa has been extremely limited. And how we can bring that into the mix is, of course, quite difficult, because we only have 1/3 of households that can afford a passenger car, let alone an electric car. And so how do we bring effectively electric vehicles into public transport, in terms of government fleet, and into entry-level vehicles, ideally? It is critical to make sure that we have an inclusive rollout that can support effectively manufacturing going forward. So that is a key component of the work that I've been involved in. A second component has been around the just transition of the communities and people and the workforce that are employed in the broader transport value chains as we effectively transition to e-mobility. And so yes, a lot of that is of course around manufacturing and the value chains, but it's broader than this. What about mechanics? What about petrol attendants? What about people who work currently in refineries or in any of the transport systems? What about people who work, in the public transports? In South Africa, we have minibus taxis, and so how do we transition that workforce, those communities effectively to new technologies, is something that that worries us quite a great deal. It's a large share of employment. You know, just to give you one number, in South Africa we have 250,000 mechanics. Okay, that's a large number of people that now have to be upskilled. You know, and so how we do that going forward is a critical a critical issue. And then lastly, we've been working at it from of course the mineral angle. How do you build value chains, particularly around batteries, you know, lithium-ion batteries in the region. Of course, DRC, Zambia is always on everybody's mind when it comes to batteries. But in Southern Africa more broadly, and on the continent more broadly, how do we leverage the minerals that we have in the continent for effectively beneficiation, but more importantly for manufacturing, you know, and for inclusive employment in services and in industries going forward. It's a difficult equation to solve, but very much needed so that we can build effectively those value chains going forward across the board. So that's in a nutshell really the sort of key angles that I've been exploring in my work in terms of the transition to sustainable mobility in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing those insights, Kelo, and we are of course looking forward also to hearing a much in-depth insight in the discussion on. Thank you. And now we welcome Mr. Dr. Dr. Sise from the Ethiopia Policy Studies Institute to share some insights and introduce himself.
Thank you very much, Neville, and really thank you, the Agora, and then the other teams who have worked hard to bring in this session on sustainable transport. My name is Mulugeta, and I work for the government policy think tank called Ethiopian Policy Studies Institute, which is a public policy think tank, works in production of evidences and then evaluation of policy on range of issues, including in social and then economic aspects. I am a lawyer by training, so environmental law has been my area of focus for past few years. Regarding the activities that I was engaged and then the activities that have been taken care of by Policy Studies Institute regarding sustainable transport. One of my area of interest and engagement was in sustainable transport, and then more specifically this reduction of emissions from the transport sector. As the previous speaker said, when we talk about sustainable transport, much in Africa and developing countries has been about how can we provide transport services with reliability and cost efficiency, and then safety and security, and then as well as without emitting much to the environment. So the theories, one of the theories that I've tried to test is the theory of environmental leapfrogging, and what would that look like in the developing countries context. When we talk about technology leapfrogging, oftentimes, especially in the transport sector, we're talking about accelerated adoption of electric vehicles or an EV, which are considered to be advanced technologies. But when it comes to developing countries like Ethiopia, leapfrogging scenario could be different. Much of the daily routes are covered by non-motorized transport and public transport. So my theory is to look into ways of modernizing and the non-motorized transport sector, and the public transport sector. What sort of strategies and then what sort of regulatory and institutional frameworks could make the NMT, non-motorized transport, which is cycling and walking as said previously, and then as well as public transport, much safer and accessible to everyone. So the leapfrogging scenario, moving away from EV adoption, there could be and then are other scenarios like NMT and public transport. So one of my work revolves around making NMT and public transport one of the feasible modes of transport to go forward in developing countries, and as well as to tackle the rate of motorization in the developing country. Another activity that we at the PSI work is an executive capacity building on energy and then as well as transport strategies. One of the projects that we executed was the Inclusive Green Economy Program, which is in collaboration with the University of Gothenburg in Sweden and along with the Environment for Development Center. This executive capacity building training recruits 5 executive officials from different offices, and it works in 5 other countries as well, including Ethiopia. So these 5 government officials will be trained on inclusive green economy strategies. They will be exposed to new ideas, new policies, new scenarios on inclusive green economy. There will be shared experiences from other countries, both from the developing and then the developed as well. And then they will be asked to write research proposals. These are, as I said, these are government officials who are very keen and close to the activities that the government does. So one of our colleagues in this program in 2021 wrote a proposal on creating enabling environment for adoption of electric vehicles. He talked to industry actors, automotive sectors. He talked to government officials, stakeholders, and he came up with a proposal document. And by that time, Ethiopia and of course most of other developing countries didn't have any sort of incentive package for accelerated adoption of EV vehicles. So what he came up with was a package of economic incentives, and then as well as creation of enabling environment, including EV charging. So that package of economic incentives included removal of customs duties and then other taxes on imported and as well as locally assembled EVs. And then his proposal got a chance to be reviewed by government officials and then as well as the Minister of Finance, which often issues this kind of economic policies. So based on that research that our fellow has done, the Minister of Transport and Logistics and the Minister of Finance issued a new regulation in 2022, which effectively eliminated customs duties on all EVs and then lowered by close to 40–50% other charges like excise and the like. So training executives who are very close to the sector, even if it is an energy, but has helped Ethiopia to have one of the very advanced economic incentives on EV. Now, EVs in Ethiopia are free from customs duties and then most of the taxes. And if it is locally assembled or produced, the rates are close to zero. So this has been one of the works that the Policy Studies Institute have worked with the University of Gothenburg and Environment for Development Center to come up with this. And the other aspect that we've done was an preparation of standard for EV charging, along with the Energy and Petroleum Authority. So there are avenues that we can work more, but we've been trying to do our best. Never, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that detailed insight. Quite exciting developments that are happening in the East and also Southern Africa that were shared by our experts on the panel today. And now, last but not least, we are moving to West Africa, and we are hearing introductions and short insight from Ms. Doris Agbevivi, my apologies. And Ms. Doris is the project coordinator for the Drive Electric initiative at the Ghana Energy Commission. So it's one thing that there are think tanks on the other side, but the direct engagement is on the public sector side, on the government side. So it's important to include the perspective in this discussion. I hand over to you, Ms. Doris.
Thank you. With such introductions, I think we are writing a book already. So I think I may just conclude the books for you since it seems like there are long introductions running around. But Neville, I'm going to charge you for my name. Anytime you get it wrong, you pay me some euros. So we're going to have it that way. Yeah, my name is Doris Demagbebibi. I'm with the Energy Commission of Ghana, and I have been the brain behind the Drive Electric initiative. And I think since I started this initiative, I've become like the voice of mobility in Ghana and in most of the West African conversations. Prior to that, I've been an energy economist trained in that field, worked mostly in the energy space. And I think 5 years to now, I have been mostly in transport and energy intersection, the nexus between that. And it's been crucial because we know of the mobility transitions and what that represents for energy and then the transport sector. And I conceptualized and started Ghana's Drive Electric initiative about 5 years ago. And through that, I have been doing work as a think tank and as a policy maker, because, you know, when you don't have a think tank in the space, something has to inform policy. We don't just get up and write policy. Research informs policy, and policy in a way also informs research. So I've been working tangent on doing both sides of the conversation for a while now. In terms of awareness, I have under the initiative organized Ghana's first e-mobility conference, bringing electric vehicles and people together for that deliberation, both in policy and the private sector space. We've brought together Ghana's first public charging forum, trying to get the private sector into the conversation. It's supposed to be a public-private partnership when it comes to rolling out of the charging infrastructure here in Ghana. We led the baseline study, which we get to understand that research has to be what forms policy. And because there's not been that many think tanks in the space, I had to do that in terms of the research, getting the data and writing the baseline. And this baseline study has been what has informed our our transport policy. We've got an EV policy now, which of course was informed from the baseline study. And that is how I believe policy should be evolving on the continent. We shouldn't have to just write policy without research. So I believe the work of the think tanks is quite cut out for them in terms of that space, and bringing that research has to be formidable research and bringing that into the conversation. I've had to write policy proposals for incentives, which have dangled all the way to the presidency to be able to get incentives for the Ghanaian economy when it comes to the EV conversations. Really, of course, we would have to bring every person in the space together in these conversations. The customs, the ministries of transport, energy, the trade and industry, everybody has to come into this conversation. And that is what you hear today, that Ghana has an EV policy. It was informed by a baseline study that, of course, was done in the background and took almost 2 years of work across the whole country, going around, taking data, trying to write this research work. These are works that usually is not loud enough, but it's necessary for an industry to grow, an industry like this that is quite new to us and that requires a very unique nexus between two holistic industries on their own in terms of energy and transport. So today we have incentives for Ghana. We have customs exemptions on 2- and 3-wheeler importation parts. We have customs exemptions on electric buses in the country, and that is what has informed all of these conversations. Today, the charging infrastructure framework is being led by the private sector, and which is something I push rigorously, because where you see countries like Europe, you see their municipals, their governments lead the charging infrastructure framework. Having done that study and come in to see where where we stand as a continent and where the West stands. We're seeing that it may possibly work better if it's a public-private partnership and we have the private sector leading that kind of conversation. And so now we have about 7 charging stations and public charging stations in the country. And this, of course, was informed by this. We've adapted charging standards for the country. And that, again, to do that standards, we had to do a lot of background research to be able to determine which standards will fit the country, because we're adapting IEC standards, International Electrotechnical Committee standard for the country. And that means that doing that research, that again becomes the work of a think tank to be able to look at the framework you have in your country and be able to see what will fit for that country. As the first introduction came, every country is going to have a different approach to this. And that has been my song I've sung so far. And I believe that if we look at it from that context, it's going to be one that will push the argument a bit better. So my work has been literally, I'm usually called an EV ecosystem enabler because I've worked on every side of it, from the policies, the charging infrastructure, to the vehicle standardizations, which we have now just done. And we are yet to gazette those standards for the country. We have drafted regulations for electric vehicle charging in the country, and that regulation, of course, to be able to do that, again, if there had been data from the research side, it would also inform that, really. So I believe the crust of everything is research, and something that is core, that is really the foundation of whatever we do in policy. And without that level of research coming from the think tank space, policymakers like myself would decide to go a step further, to go do the research that then comes to inform the policy. It just takes a longer time to be able to do that policy work, because the idea is, to do policy, but then you can't just write policy. So I go to do a baseline study to understand the framework in the country, and that takes longer. But I think it's a very, if we marry the two nicely and we align the work of policy and then the think tanks, it's just right up in the space that we want to be able to do. So it's a whole conversation when it comes to the EV sector, in terms of assembling 2- and 3-wheelers, which you see a lot now happening from West Africa. I mean, that was mainly pushed mainly by the incentives that we have now for the SKD and CKD parts that come into the country, for them to be able to assemble those parts. And these, again, are the conversations that I want to point out. So I'm actually happy to be here, to be talking on these matters, and we can just set the ball rolling as we talk more.
Thank you so much, Doris, for those insights from Ghana. There's a common thread that I'm seeing in the work that you've done, the focus on the transition, the global megatrend of electric mobility. How do African countries ensure that they are not left behind? So it's very interesting to see that already think tanks and government institutions are prioritizing this sector, but at the same time, not losing sight also of the active mobility and public transport that are also key to us achieving sustainable transport. So thank you so much for those insights. And now for our discussion round. We understand, of course, how can we accelerate this transition to sustainable transport on the continent, and what is the role that think tanks can play then in supporting this transition? And I would like to start again with Malindi. Sustainable transport is key to achieving global climate goals, but we see that somehow there are not a lot of think tanks that are working in this space on the continent. So how can we encourage more think tanks to work in this area?
Yeah, thanks, Novo, for that question. And I think you and I have been working in the background trying to identify think tanks on the continent that are working in this space, and it's been very difficult. A few things for me. I think number one is just the emphasis to broaden the narrative around sustainable transport. I think, again, I circle back to my earlier discussion on the narrative around reducing emissions from transportation, while being very important, is not always immediately relatable in the African context, because our emissions are still low. Of course, we don't want to be left behind in the electric mobility drive, but we have to look at what challenges do we need to immediately resolve in the transportation sector, and its issues around access again. Is everybody able to access services and other issues in using transport modes that are accessible for them, looking at issues of equity, how are governments allocating resources across all modes of transport, issues around inclusion, are we looking at breaking some of those barriers, looking at vulnerable groups of users, for example, persons living with disabilities, children, women, senior citizens, safety issues, is it safe to travel? Those are things that are impacting livelihoods every day. And I think that if we broadened the narrative around sustainable transport to really highlight those other aspects, we can get a lot more think tanks into this space. Otherwise, right now, it's either you're on the space of electric mobility or emissions modeling, and those are quite limiting. Number two is, I think we also need to highlight the fact that this drive to sustainable transport is a multidisciplinary effort. I think in the past, there's been heavy focus on the role of engineering in this space, which of course is very critical, and engineering will forever remain a very big part of transportation, especially as it relates to infrastructure. But there are also a lot of other components that require other disciplines. There's a big behavioral component. If, for example, for a country like Zambia, where most people are already walking, in the realm of sustainable transport, we need to keep these people already walking. And then we need to incentivize those that are driving to use those other modes like public transport, walking or cycling. There's a behavioral component there if you have to change behavior. There's also a health aspect to sustainable transport. You need the data scientists. So the point I'm making here is sustainable transport is a multidisciplinary effort. And if it's viewed in that sense, we'll encourage a lot more think tanks into this space. The third thing, and maybe I'll end there for this round, is the role of partnerships. And here, I think for me, there are three-tier partnerships. There's looking internationally, and then regionally, and then locally. So internationally here, I want to emphasize like global north to global south partnerships between think tanks. And as ZIPA, we've been a beneficiary of this type of partnership, especially working with the Climate Compatible Growth Program. Here in Africa, we've worked with ITDP. This is a very big agenda. We have to partner if we have to be successful. We have to learn from others. And Africa is being told now to leapfrog, to avoid the mistakes of the global north. And we can only do that by also learning from others. Regionally, think tanks in Africa have to come together, to work together, to know each other. And I think developing networks can help to facilitate that process. And if we are a united front, it makes it easier for us to carry out joint research, facilitate knowledge sharing around these areas of sustainable transport. But locally also, I want to emphasize that we can't do this without the local partners. As ZIPA, we have always carried all the key stakeholders in our work. We are working very closely with the government. The Ministry of Transport and Logistics has been instrumental in supporting our work. We are working a lot with civil society. Civil society is the one that takes us to the grassroots. We can't leave civil society out. We have the academic institutions. Think tanks are not necessarily supposed to be bogged down with conducting scientific research. Our role is to bridge the gap between the scientific research and the decision makers, translating scientific research into knowledge products that decision makers can readily relate to. Private sector, I think Doris mentioned how critical the private sector has been. Issues around financing, we need to think a bit more broadly. So for now, Neville, I think I want to focus on these three. Broadening the narrative on sustainable transport. This is a multidisciplinary effort, and the role of partnerships. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that question, for those insights. My next question goes to Mr. Mason Moncler Galo. So in Germany, for every €1 that the government invests, it attracts about €9 of private sector investment. Do you think think tanks could help to achieve a similar outcome for investment in Africa?
That's a big question. And I think, you know, certainly think tank can play a key role in building bridges, you know, and I think that for me is something that we don't value enough quite often, you know. The fact that think tanks can be very well positioned to be bridge builders that are trusted by everyone, you know, and for me, that is quite important in the work that we do, you know. As I always tell people, you can disagree, but you have to respect the work, you know, and you have to trust the evidence. You know, of course, people will have different understandings of what has to happen and what needs to be done and how it has to be achieved. But it is important that think tanks play that role of providing that objective evidence, those policy recommendations that are rooted in local perspectives and the evidence on the ground, and particularly help bridge that gap between the public and the private sector, but also, of course, with unions and civil society. And part of that is thinking about how we can effectively, you know, accelerate the transition. And that's only going to happen, I think you're pointing to that, by leveraging funding from both the public and the private sector. You know, we know that African governments on the whole don't have a lot of resources to spare, certainly. I think it's really important for the public sector to show the direction of travel, direct investment, and put those sort of seed fundings where it matters. But to do that really in partnership, you know, of course, with the private sector to bolster that investment going forward. And so showing how this can happen is really important. And I think it's about also sort of demystifying some of the risks, but also, you know, highlighting clearly the opportunities. You know, we have lots of concerns about, you know, what are the parts of the value chain that the private sector should invest in versus the public sector. You know, we've had long debates, for instance, South Africa, but charging infrastructure, for instance, and who should invest in charging infrastructure? And you know, of course, this is always a difficult discussion to have when, again, you know, the electric mobility network serves to date a very small part of the population, primarily high-income households and businesses. You know, so putting money into electric, you know, charging infrastructure versus servicing the needs of the bulk of the population through public transport or, you know, better spatial planning and so forth is always a big tension. We also feel it, you know, I know colleagues have mentioned the issue of subsidies. You know, we've been debating subsidies for electric cars in South Africa for years, whether we should have subsidies, you know. And of course, you know, industry is pushing quite hard to say, well, we need a program to support the demand for electric vehicles. And I think on paper, it makes sense, you know, of course, you know, if you want to push people buying electric vehicles, be it in public transport or in freight or in passenger vehicle, it makes sense. But then we have to think about the costs and the benefits. You know, is this socially progressive? Is it politically acceptable? You know, in a country with high levels of unemployment, even higher levels of inequality, to effectively subsidize an industry for a very small part of the population. And so we have to bring the evidence about how to do that creatively, you know, how to do that differently. And here I think partnerships with public and private sector, but also with our counterparts in, you know, in Europe and the global north are critical. One of the ideas that we've been looking at is to provide, for example, low interest loans for EV buyers. You know, interest rates in South Africa for a car, if you buy a car today, you're probably looking at 12 to 15% interest rates, okay, for your car payments. And so if we could have affordable concessional finance from Germany, say, that would potentially enable to then lower the interest rates on EV buyers and then provide a degree of subsidy, for instance, that could benefit everyone in the system effectively without actually costing money to the states. And so I think think tanks are critical in thinking about those innovative solutions and say, well, we understand the constraints. How do we think about the opportunities a bit differently and bring everyone together around the table? I think that is really one of the key roles that think tanks can play, and that certainly we've tried to play in South Africa.
Thank you so much. So de-risking investments and highlighting opportunities. Thank you very much. My next question goes to Ms. Doris. And, we are talking about think tanks engaging decision makers. So what are some of the success criteria for think tanks to engage offices such as yours and for their policy recommendations to be taken up?
Thank you. I think I loved hearing all that was being mentioned across board. I mean, there are a bit of nuances in the discussions when it comes to sustainable transport. And on a large scale, we have to understand that there are competing demands and competing needs for every country. And that competing need requires that you either tailor incentives or you tailor any other policy measure that you want to take to the lowest hanging fruit, or maybe to take it to where it's needed the most, right? And most of the times, I think when think tanks have research and they are not tailored and they come as a very far-fetched gap, really, it's a more of a disconnect in the research between what is actually happening in the country and what a think tank is proposing. It really just becomes a research or work that sits on the decks, and it doesn't really go beyond that. The idea is I like hearing from across every country, and at least I have studied a bit across the African continent and in Europe to be able to understand how the contexts are a bit different. What is happening in Rwanda is different. What is happening in Nairobi is different. What is happening in South Africa is different. And all of them have prioritized needs in a different manner, which you find. Then when you come to West Africa, even between Ghana and Nigeria is different. Ghana and Lomé is different. So if you come for every government and every think tank, you would want to see which government am I tailoring this to? What is their earnest needs? Now, how can I balance those needs that they have with what should be the ideal leapfrog measure for those needs? Either than that, the government will definitely come up with a policy because that's what they will do. But will the policy be informed by a research? It may not be informed by a research. So it's mostly about tailoring research to issues on the ground. All of the studies I did to be able to feed into the Drive Electric, at some point people thought the Drive Electric initiative was a think tank because I was doing more groundwork, legwork, and for a long time before it feeds into policy. It may be because of my training. I believe that research should inform policy, but in doing that, it took a lot of time in doing the think tank works or the policy work, and then coming to bridge the gaps. Let's say getting the private sector to lead infrastructure when it comes to charging stations. It's a clear case that the government may not have funds to be able to push into those because the government has competing needs. So you know that if you leave the charging infrastructure framework to the government, it may not happen. What then do you want to do? You want to be able to come up and make it a private sector argument, really, with government backing it with stuff like standards, regulations, and providing an enabling environment for the private sector to go. But to be able to engage the private sector, it required me doing research. I was in Dundee City for a while, trying to liaise with the council there because there are people I know studying their landscape for their charging hubs and all of that, trying to get that conversation, getting back to Ghana and bringing together actors of people in the space. I mean, I brought together all the oil marketing operators, all the CEOs in one room and had to get them to come into this conversation. That is the work that a think tank may do, doing the research, coming to bridge that gap between the scientific research and what a policymaker would do. Now, that makes sure that the private sector now saw a business case for going into those conversations. It's cases like coming up with research for business cases, which we've just completed one with the UNDP, business cases for charging infrastructure for the private sector. So it becomes a holistic business angle where you have a battery swap station, but that same battery swap station informs that the person is assembling two-wheelers, right? And those two-wheelers will go and swap at the station, right? It's a holistic business measure. But to be able to do such research to inform even the private sector or to inform the public sector in developing the policies that would equally affect the private sector, the think tank sits right there in the middle. So it's about tailored research that needs to be able to fit into the country-specific measures that are required for that country. I would then further say it's about alignment of needs, and those needs are equally important when those research is tailored. Ghana, for instance, in doing our incentives, I mean, that as you saw, I did a whole policy brief on those incentives. My proposals were all time-based. It was all, 100% for fully electric, 50% for HEVs. I said it should be 10 years to be reviewed every year. It means that we had to sit in a meeting room for days, arguing how that should work, right? That came up to a point where the government had to look at what are the funds available? What can we do with the funds now? How can we use that to create an ecosystem that enables the private sector? So if you look at our incentives, it didn't target the private owner of electric vehicles because the government was not in a position to do that at the moment, but it did target the people who are going to bring the parts to assemble the 2- and 3-wheelers, right? Because you want to either create a whole industry of those people and then get jobs on the angle. So the subsidies were not just thrown out, the incentives were not just thrown out, it's tailored. But that tailored one had to come in from a research and then a bridged gap between those and then the Ministry of Finance to sit down to. So again, the competing needs and competing demands means that the think tanks come into that. And the third one would be their engagement and their partnerships. You don't just start doing the research and then come and trust it to the government and say, this is what I think will inform policy. Who should it inform? That's the question. Who should it inform? When you start the research, you involve the people that would be informed by it. You involve them even in the lowest stage. You involve 1 or 2 of them in the conversation crafting, in actually coming up with the objectives of those research that you want to do in that space. And to be able to say, okay, from that very onset, the gap between the scientific research and policy has been bridged because you started the conversation by engagement. You started by actually bringing the actors together. And you may not, of course, you may not get the top people in there. You may not get the senior managers or the assistant managers in there, but you still start with some officers and policy people that would come in to really bring that conversation to space. Then those institutions that you need, if you were going to do something on incentives, you want to have at least one person from finance in the room. If you were going to do something that has got to do with the energy gap and all, you want to have the one person from the Ministry of Energy. What it means is when you are almost ready to bring those proposals to them, you are not bringing it as a new proposal, but a proposal that they have heard along the way whilst it was being done, because that officer always had to go back to report. And that really makes people feel included because it's about inclusivity in this conversation. You are having a nexus between so many institutions to make sustainable transport work. When it comes to bikes, when it comes to we not having bike lanes in West Africa and or most parts of Africa, we not having all of the infrastructure. Even when you have a bike, there's no space to park your bike. There's no, I'm in Oxford at the moment, and Oxford is all bike, right? It's a place that you find a different conversation here than you would find here because the infrastructure is there. But those infrastructure, if you look at the Oxford landscape, it was a lot of research that informed it. They're doing a current research with bikes given to homes to do. Who would do that research? It's a think tank that would do that research and tease out how they can use bikes to really create new trips and all of those conversations. So it's key. It's about competing demand. It's about tailored research. It's about engagement, and it's about partnership. And clearly it's about aligning the needs of those countries to what you do as a research and a think tank. That is what makes it come back to the policymaker in a very strong and cogent manner.
Thank you. Thank you for that comprehensive detail and sharing your insight. Thank you so much. Last but not least, Mr. or Dr. Sise, if you could share, we've heard that there are gaps in various areas. We've heard that earlier Malindi mentioned that really to attract more think tanks to work in this space, perhaps there's a need for greater collaboration. There's a need for perhaps networking or coming up with a network for sustainable transport for think tanks. So in your view, how would such a think tank be structured to have an impact on sustainable transport in Africa?
Thank you, Neville. That's a very good question, and would like to emphasize and say that I couldn't agree more on what the previous speakers have said about the huge gap that policy think tanks could fill, bridging the research environment arena and then the policy making, and then narrowing down as well the distance between scientific researches and as well as policy processes, as Doris were mentioning. And another aspect of this is even if the approaches could be different depending on the specific country context, as Doris was mentioning, but unfortunately we are facing same kind of challenges when it comes to sustainable transport. The issues of sustainable transport, be it the mitigation aspect of it, or the other aspects of sustainable transport in terms of expanding access, reliability, security, and all those issues are very common to most African countries. And even when you go deeper, even some of the strategies, I would say, are very, very much similar, like adoption of incentives and restriction of importation of used cars, which has been in place in most African countries. So the communality of the challenge itself will force policy think tanks to come together and then work and then have a multiplier effect, a spillover effect into other African countries as well. So in terms of bringing the think tanks in a certain continental or regional platform or forum, that's kind of arrangements that I would suggest, something like platforms, or you call it a forum, or you call it consortium, which brings in all policy think tanks that work or that are interested to work. As Malindi was mentioning, I think we need to broaden when we think of sustainable transport, not only focus on the engineering aspect of it, but also the other aspects of it, the psychological makeup, the behavioral makeup, the equity element, the policy and law element, the economics element, the environmental element. So there are quite a lot of think tanks who do not have a dedicated center or unit working on transport, but who works in one or another way, contribute to the policy making in transport. So platform that brings in all those different think tanks would be an ideal for the country. To start this process, the first thing that I think is to check existing platforms across Africa, even if they are not dedicated in sustainable transport, but there are think tanks or researchers network across the continent, like the African Economic Research Consortium, which is a well-known collection of experts in think tanks as well. The African International Economic Law Network, or Afroeconomics Law. These are the networks that we have at continental level, which can lend us some experience, share us some experience in how to organize these things. And then as well as look into other initiatives as well. While I was doing kind of background research on how to bring these think tanks together, I came across an AU Commission engagement in African Think Tank Platform Project, which is a 4-year project at the AU Commission, funded by, I think probably by World Bank, which also aspires to bring in and then nurture policy think tanks across the country. So look into existing initiatives, what kind of lessons can be gained and what kind of voids could be filled with the new initiative. Another aspect is someone need to take this initiative. I would say that everybody's apple is no one's apple. So there should be someone, some institution, or kind of an interim executive or organizing committee of 4 or 5 who takes the initiative and who takes the initiative to bring in ideas from everywhere and then lead the establishment of this platform or forum. That initiative or that executive or interim executive could engage on online platforms and could meet frequently online and then organize meetings and to set this shared purpose, shared goal, and agree on roles and responsibilities. So that's an interim collection of 3, 4, 5 individuals could take the initiative, and then
these individuals could be you.
could be anyone. I mean, we have
in the interest of time.
of
In the interest of time, so that we have a little bit of time left for the Q&A, thank you. I would thank you so much for those insights that you shared on how a possible structure could look like to benchmark and look at some of the initiatives that are out there on the continental level, such as the African Union initiative that you mentioned, but then to really target it towards sustainable transport, as transport is the backbone of economies. If transport is not moving, we saw in the last pandemic, if transport is not moving, goods and people are not moving. So I think there should be a targeted intervention for transport. Thank you very much, Dr. Sise. A last round, and very briefly in one sentence for each panelist, and we can start with Doris. If you had 1 million to invest for sustainable transport in Africa, where would you invest it? Just one sentence, please.
It's going to be in the public sector. It's going to be in the public transportation sector, the public transportation sector, buses, 2, 3-wheelers, and bikes first.
Thank you. Thank you. Quickly, Malindi. If you had 1 million to invest in sustainable transport in Africa, where would you invest it?
Similarly, to be definitely public transportation, mass transit, I think is very key, but also infrastructure for walking and cycling.
Infrastructure for walking. Thank you so much. Dr. Sise, where would you invest your 1 million in sustainable transport?
Not really a different answer. That would be in public transport and then NMT.
NMT, okay. And last but not least,
then motorized transport, walking and cycling. Yeah.
Last but not least, Mr. Mason Clare, where would you invest your 1 million?
So I'll say, to complement what my colleagues have said, I'll invest it in the manufacturing for the public transport, so that actually we move people with locally made technologies and create jobs throughout the value chain.
Thank you so much. So local manufacturing, perhaps for electric buses, for instance. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your insights. First of all, that transport, sustainable transport is a cross-cutting issue. It's a multidisciplinary challenge. Secondly, that think tanks can play a role in de-risking investments for sustainable transport and also highlighting where the opportunities or low-hanging fruits are. Thirdly, that public authorities or the governments are interested in seeing really policy recommendations that are fit for context and that can be applied specifically in those specific, whether it's in the East or West, as Doris mentioned, but policies that are specifically fit for the context of that country. And then last but not least, yes, there is value in think tanks coming together in a platform or forum to collaborate, share ideas, and share capacities, and in leveraging partnerships for sustainable transport. So thank you so much to each of you for your insights. And now, last but not least, we'll then move on to the Q&A section, and I will then pose to you if there were some questions in the chat. Some of the questions that we have received from the participants. So I have some questions here from the audience. I will take the first one, and this goes out to all the speakers. Do you have examples of public and private sector coming together successfully and comment on the type of format? So do you have examples of public and private sector coming together successfully? And if you could comment on the type of format. So is it a forum? Is it ad hoc? And I would like to look for a volunteer who would like to take up this question on the panel. Thank you so much, Ms. Doris. Yes, very briefly, in the interest of time, if you could give 2 sentences.
I think because I've been pushing a lot on public-private partnership, I have quite a number of examples to give on this one. Let's take it that even with starting the mobility initiative in Ghana, organizing the first public charging forum and everything that was done alongside those was funded through both the private sector. And even I didn't use funds from the Energy Commission. I want that to go out there because the private sector were equally, invested in seeing mobility become a conversation in the government space, right? Because they were going to come into play, they were actors in the space. So the funding for the conference came from the private sector. Yes, I offered them visibility in that term. I drove electric vehicles in Ghana for the past 3 years, even before leaving, and all those vehicles were offered by the private sector because it was supposed to be sort of like I was a mobile billboard, let me call it that way. So a mobile billboard moving around, and everywhere you go, there were questions. And of course, I was ready to answer questions, but it was a way of creating awareness on the wheels, right? So awareness was going on wheels to supermarkets, to the churches, to the mechanics. I love best the mechanic shops when I go there because that place takes me like a whole day. They would open the bonnets. They will need to be sure there is no engine in the car. They will need to, they had questions, and these were ways that you are able to use. That was a the private sector thing because the private sector offered the vehicle, the public sector, me, and of course my network and all allowed me to carry the message a bit more further. There's so many several examples that come along with it, but I just wanted to throw 2 out there before you time me again.
Thank you so much, Doris. So in terms of public awareness, for instance, the industry can demonstrate to decision makers how technology works. And that was a very good example. Thank you so much. Moving on to the next question from the chat. South Africa, Gaylord, this goes to you. Electrification of freight last mile seems to be already happening in South Africa. Do you see potential for the creation of new jobs in that space? And which OEMs are manufacturing, not only assembling EVs directly in South Africa? I think it's a bit of a mouthful question, but to summarize, do you see the creation of new jobs in electrification of freight specifically? And what OEMs are already manufacturing EVs for freight in South Africa?
Okay, yeah, so we've got it's a big question. So it's a different market, we've got we actually have some really innovative companies on the sort of last mile electrification. They came from the battery space, actually, and then they developed their own batteries, locally made, and they import the cell, of course, the lithium-ion battery cell, but then make everything else locally. And then some of them said, well, but how we just sort of then make 2 or 3 wheelers for the electrification of the last mile, and they've been very successful. One of them actually has got quite a big business deal with DHL on the African continent, plus some local brands in South Africa that take a lot. And so it's really a vibrant space. I think it's got a lot of opportunities if we can link the whole ecosystem. And I think that's what for me is quite important. You can create a lot of jobs, if you have the manufacturing, you've got the drivers, you've got the charging station, all the swapping station, you've got the sort of service centers, then if you can build that whole ecosystem, then it's really really interesting, and we've seen actually that popping up quite a lot in the country and growing. The one thing we don't make the link on quite yet is between that industry, which is quite organic and growing, but happening a little bit under the radar, and the sort of mainstream, so to speak, mass market of automotive, and those big companies are not necessarily connected to that dynamic. And so how we build those bridges, because certainly in the South African case, as I said, we have 7 big OEMs in the country, soon to be 8. These could literally help grow that industry going forward. And so that's some of the linkages that we are trying to do as these OEMs are progressively transitioning to electric mobility. But now we don't really have manufacturing of battery electric vehicles by these OEMs, but some have started to manufacture hybrids in South Africa already. So there is quite a lot of potentially around the battery.
Thank you so much. I have one last question, 2 last questions, and we are running very tightly on time. So please, I ask the panelists to be very concise in their response. To Mulungeta, the question is, what is the average selling price for an EV in your country? Europe still aims to be below 25,000 euros. So what is the average price for an EV in your country? If you are aware.
Thank you very much for that, Neville. I do not have the exact figure right now, but it as we all know, it depends on the size of the vehicle itself. The small sedan EV cars could be sold for a little more than 10,000 USD, but the higher ones could go, as we all know, about $40,000 per car. But it really depends on, and we do not have yet that market information available at hand. Neville.
Thank you so much, Mulungeta. And then the final question, we are almost nearing the end of our Q&A session and a short summary. This goes to you, Malindi. It might be key to create regional markets for EVs beyond single countries, so private investments are attracted. How do we encourage regional cooperation to establish a regional market?
Sorry, Navo, I missed the first part of that question. It's around?
Thank you. So I will repeat it to you. It might take to adopt or accelerate the adoption of EVs. It will take a regional market beyond single country markets to consolidate the market so that we can attract private investment. So how do we encourage greater regional cooperation to establish regional markets?
Okay, so first I'll make a disclaimer. I'm not an expert in electric mobility, but I think from the economics perspective, because I understand that a lot of African countries, Zambia included, have like some of those critical minerals which are important for the electric vehicle value chain. And we are already seeing these partnerships coming in between countries. Like Zambia, for example, has signed an MOU with DRC. I think that's around the manufacturing of the electric vehicle batteries on the continent. So I think we need to accelerate more of these partnerships, but also leveraging on already existing agreements like the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, which has removed barriers to trade and things around that. And also, I think regional policies around making it more conducive for the private sector to come in and actually invest could help accelerate and make sure that we create our own market here on the continent for electric vehicles. So that would be my take on that.
Thank you so much, Malindi. Very, very insightful. Thank you so much. And thank you to all the panelists for your insights that you've shared today. Very, very fruitful discussion that it's key to establish collaboration. It's key to establish partnerships and share capacities and resources. And that think tanks do have a key role to play in advising governments and sort of bringing together, as our name Agora Verkehrswende stands for. Agora means bringing different actors to the table in the aim of achieving a greater good. And for us, that is sustainable transport on the continent. Before we close off, I have one last question to the participants. Same question for you. Please join Slido quickly. If you had €1 million dollars to invest in sustainable transport in Africa, where would you invest it in these three options that you see that the panelists said that they would invest in? First option, public transport. Second option, infrastructure for walking and cycling. Third option, local manufacturing for public transport. And option 4 could be your own suggestion. We already see some responses. Thank you so much. I believe we have at least 8 responses. So we see that equally, oh, it's changing. We see that public transport and infrastructure are where some of the funds perhaps are needed the most to accelerate our transition to sustainable transport. Thank you so much for the participants and your participation in our activities in Slido. We appreciate it. And now to close off, I would like to hand over to Ms. Andrea Palmer from the GIZ team to give our closing statement.
Thank you, Nabil. Thank you, everyone. The system, right? Like we need to strengthen the public transport in order to gain the momentum. Also important to know that we need to do active infrastructure and bike lanes, right? And then, of course, connected to the development and the opportunities for the work and employability, come out with some manufacturing solutions. So all coherent, and I like the perspective of the think tanks. So Nabil, we are collecting messages from every session, and you will all understand why. And you are the last but not least. And what will be your key message takeaway to put in our beautiful postcard?
The key message from our session would be that sustainable transport is a joint investment. That is it. We all need to come together and invest in this.
That's good.
Course.
That's good.
Thank you.
Sustainable investment. Thank you very much for the think tank and for every one of you and the insights. Very important. Civil society plays a key role, the other sectors as well. And then you are helping us to do what we were looking for this year, connecting the dots, fostering global transport climate action. We need policies, of course, but we also need action. And this is the summary of what has been the Transport and Climate Change Week 2024 online. People connected with people, experts, decision makers, civil society, think tanks, our partners, and everyone here in this visual where every message was collected, and we keep building knowledge and this opportunity with the legacy of having left ideas, experiences, recommendations available very soon in our Changing Transport YouTube channel. The week in numbers, because if we do not track change, we do not know how much have we achieved. And this is this week in numbers. We have had 1,548 participants registered. They will be receiving every material that we have produced. So if you have not yet registered yourself, you are still on time. You will be receiving straight in your mail all we have produced this week. 108 countries represented, 77 speakers. So thank you for you speakers. And of course, 5 days of knowledge, 16 sessions, 24 hours recorded for you, available on our Changing Transport channel. 2 ways to join, online and now in our YouTube channel. Thank you for the celebration. Actually, I feel lonely celebrating by myself. So I would like to give appreciation to the whole team behind the scene, especially the core team 2024, who has led the preparation, coordination, and all that was needed for this Transport Week. So thank you, Karina, Marlene, Hannah, Crystal, Mariana, Rabea, and Daniel. And with that, an extensive thank you for everyone in the countries and the regions making this possible. You understand that this is not made by one person. So this is what we are doing, connecting people with people to bring new ideas and innovation. This was our Transport and Climate Change Week. And with nothing else to say, thank you, everyone. And we see us again in another opportunity. Have a nice rest of the day. Bye.
Bye-bye. See you later.
Chao, adiós. Vamos preso. Bienvenidos a Ecuador.
Hasta luego.
Bye-bye from Ghana.
Hasta luego.
See you later.
We are excited to meet you next year. See you.